Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. I go to a fair number of author events, and when I sit in the audience, I think, God, I hope he doesn't read. I can read what he's written. I want to hear what he has to say. When I'm up here with the microphone, all I want to do is read. Because, like most writers, I have more confidence in my ability with the written word than with the spoken word. So I'll do a mix of speaking and reading. The things I read will be fairly short. The book, as Eva said, is a memoir, and it's not just about me. It's also about Poland, and it's about travel writing. And it covers 14 years, from 1976 to 1989. So from the year of America's bicentennial to the year of the fall of the Berlin Wall. And those two very celebratory years were important years for me personally, because in 1976 I got my first newspaper job, and I met a young woman from Poland. In 1989 I got a job as a newspaper travel editor. Geographically, the book begins across the river in New Jersey, my home state, where I got a job at the Trenton Times. In those days, the Trenton Times was owned by the Washington Post. And the Washington Post was riding high after its breaking of the Watergate story. In 1976, in fact, the movie All the President's Men came out. Robert Redford and Dustin Hoffman playing Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. Journalism was as sexy as it was ever going to get. And the Trenton Times newsroom was full of young, bright, ambitious people who wanted to make a difference. Also, most of them had a real interest in writing. So it was a great place to begin my career. The other fortunate thing was that I was hired as a feature writer, which was, it turned out, excellent training to be a travel writer. It got me out of the office. I got to meet interesting people, spend time with them, learn about their work, learn about their lives. Because of the location of Trenton, I covered stories in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, sometimes even here in New York. I don't know, some of you here might remember, in 1977, President Jimmy Carter made a trip to Poland with a rather inept interpreter. So when he arrived in Warsaw, he announced that he had left the United States for good, and he hoped to get to know the Poles intimately. So for a while, simultaneous interpreters were in the news. So I called the head of the department at the UN and said I wanted to do a story. And he was very suspicious about the timing, but he allowed me to come, and I spent a couple of days at the UN watching the interpreters work. And it was really amazing to see their linguistic and mental agility, but also to hear how much they knew about, in so many different fields, because they were interpreting papers on all different subjects. One of the interpreters told me, if you have everything it takes to do this job, you waste it on this job. So I was extremely happy. I was having a wonderful time. And then when I thought life couldn't get any better, a young woman arrived from Poland whom I met in London the year before. Now, most of 75 and 76 I had spent in France, because I thought if I wanted to be a travel writer, I should learn another language. And on my way back from France, I stopped in London because I was coming home on a Russian ocean liner, the Mikhail Lermontov. And my first day in London, I went to a bookstore, because I had been 12 months. It's been 12 months since I've been in an English-speaking country, and I didn't have much money, so I bought one book, a book called Foreign Faces by V.S. Pritchett. And it was about his travels through Eastern Europe in the 1960s. I wasn't that interested in Eastern Europe then, but I was interested in travel writing, and I liked the author, V.S. Pritchett. I bought the book, I took it back to the hotel, which had a little bar. It was a little hotel in Paddington, but they had a bar on the first floor. And I went in and I bought a beer from a very attractive barmaid. And I took it to a table in the corner, drank it very quickly, and went back for another beer. And this time the bartender asked me where I was from, and I said, I'm from the United States. Where are you from? And she said, I'm from Poland. And immediately the wheels turned, and I said, well, I just bought this book. I showed her, it has a chapter on your homeland, and I lent it to her, knowing she'd have to see me again to give it back to me. And she did. We had one date, a lunch date in London. I learned that Hania was a student at the University of Warsaw, and she would come every summer to London, get a job, make some money, work on her English, buy some new clothes, go back to Poland in the fall. And at the end of the day, she hadn't had time to read my book. So at the end of the lunch date, I gave it to her. I wrote my name and address inside, hoping that maybe she would write to me. And she did, and we corresponded for a year. You know, this was long before email. You know, we wrote letters, and they traveled not only across the Atlantic Ocean, but across the Iron Curtain. And she wrote one letter that she was thinking of coming to Trenton, taking a year off. And I felt obliged to tell her that Trenton was not the most desirable place, unless you were an ambitious young journalist. But she came and stayed for 10 months, and we fell in love. And she went back to Poland, and I decided that I would quit my job, my promising career in journalism, and I would move to Poland. I was very much in love. But I also thought professionally this might be an interesting move because, again, I wanted to be a travel writer. This was an opportunity to live in a country that few Americans had been to. Few Americans knew anything about. So I decided I was going to go to Poland, and before I went, I enrolled in an evening class for Polish. And I'm going to read a paragraph about that miserable experience. The teacher was a prim, soft-spoken woman, which was fortunate, because the language was a bitch. About the only word I had learned from Hania was shushu, which is what she would go off into the woods to do on long car journeys after drinking lots of tea. The teacher increased my vocabulary, mostly through greetings and polite expressions. Poles, I was learning, were a very punctilious people. But the grammar was beyond teaching, or I should say learning, in a classroom. Polish, like Latin, is an inflected language. So words change depending on how they're used in a sentence. The word for dog is P-I-E-S, pronounced like the French pièce. But if you say you have a dog, it becomes sa. If you go for a walk with your dog, it becomes sem. If you give your dog a bone, it becomes su. And so on. If you want to describe your dog, the adjectives change as well. God help you if you have 2 dogs. So one day I got to train into New York to apply for a visa at the Polish consulate. It's at 37th and Madison Avenue, a beautiful Beaux-Arts building that filled me with dread. I had dealt with French bureaucracy, but this was a whole nother ballgame. This was a people's republic behind the Iron Curtain, and literally these people held my fate in their hands. And to my eternal gratitude, they gave me a 2-week visa to go to Poland. And I did. I gave my notice at the paper, and I left. And I arrived, sadly, just in time to meet Hania's mother on her deathbed. Hania was an only child, and her father had been killed in a motorcycle accident when she was a teenager. This was years after he and Helena had divorced. The marriage, never ideal, had been irreparably damaged by Helena's imprisonment. In fact, she had given birth to Hania in prison after being tried, while pregnant, for activities against the state. Her crime was providing assistance to a man sent back to Warsaw from the government in exile in London. Halina Matrash was buried in Powązki Cemetery, which is to Warsaw what Père Lachaise is to Paris, though with more of a heroic martial character. I was assigned to a motherly friend, and after the casket had been lowered into the ground, I saw Hanya being escorted out by a band in black, including a young man with leather on his arm. Adam, the ex-boyfriend, stopped by the apartment. He was a well-built, handsome man with a dark goatee. He pulled me into the bedroom and opened the Polish-English dictionary. After searching for a few seconds, he indicated the verb for love, kochać. Next, he moved to P and showed me pomagać, help. Then, looking me in the eye, he pointed in the direction of the living room where Hanya sat. I'd just gotten my first lesson in Polish gallantry. So, my new life began. I found a job teaching English at the venerable English Language College in downtown Warsaw. It was an evening school that had been founded in 1921 by a group of American Methodists, and it had educated generations of Warsawians in English. There was no religious instruction. The teachers were all Polish, and they spoke beautiful English, some of them with British accents, even though they'd never been outside of Poland, some of them. And they welcomed me, which I was happy about and somewhat surprised, because I had just fallen into this job. And they had worked and studied to become English teachers. The students were mostly high school, college age. You had to be 16 to enroll in the school. And they came in the evenings, even though they were usually studying English at school and during the day, but they'd come in the evenings to supplement what they were learning. And that amazed me, because we had classes on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday evenings, and I remembered how I'd spent my Fridays when I was in high school, and it wasn't going to language classes. I was able to change my tourist visa to a work visa, a 6-month work visa, and I started a new life. On my free days, I explored the city and discovered rather quickly there wasn't that much to explore. The old town was lovely. It had been meticulously rebuilt after its destruction in World War II. But the rest of the city was rather drab and nondescript and not that attractive. There was no street life to speak of. People went about their chores, their errands, buying the essentials with, nobody smiled at each other. There was little friendly banter with shop assistants. It was a very business-like, brusque atmosphere. And that contrasted with the atmosphere when you got into somebody's home. We would visit Hanya's friends, her relatives, and there the atmosphere was completely different. It was warm and spirited. People were having lively discussions, and lots of jokes, and lots of food, often foods you didn't see in the shops. And it was a real, for me, kind of a novel disconnect. The way the private life of Poland was so different from the public life. I think it taught me as a travel writer the importance of getting into people's homes and seeing how they live. Because it's very different often from what you see just wandering the streets. Everything important seemed to happen behind the apartment door. We rarely saw our neighbors. And I came home one evening in October and was very surprised to see all our neighbors out on the stairwell. Everybody was talking, and I had no idea what they were saying, but Hanya pulled me into the apartment and said there was this rumor that the new pope was Polish. And it was, she couldn't believe this, but we watched the news that night, and sure enough, Karol Wojtyła, the Archbishop of Krakow, had been elected pope. And the next day I went to school, and my students were sitting there with copies of the newspaper, just beaming, and you had a sense that life as they knew it was about to change. On November 1st, we went back to Powązki Cemetery with what seemed like half of Warsaw for Day of the Dead, which in Poland is very different from the Mexican version. It's very serious, very somber. People would clean up the family graves, and then they would pay their respects at the graves of the soldiers who died in the wars. Christmas arrived without much build-up, which in a way made it even more meaningful. The Polish Christmas traditions, everybody before sitting down would get a wafer on their plate, and you'd pass it. You'd go around the table and you would exchange pieces of wafer along with wishes for the coming year. There was an extra place setting for the passing stranger. And I found this very endearing because most people in Warsaw lived in apartments above the first floor. So there wasn't going to be any passing stranger. But they kept the tradition. The Polish Christmas carols I found extremely beautiful. My favorite is one called Lulaje Jezuniu.
Yeah.
And later I would hear echoes of that carol in a scherzo of Chopin. A few days after Christmas, a storm came and basically paralyzed Warsaw. Several inches of snow fell, temperatures plummeted well below zero, and as in 20-odd winters in New Jersey, I'd never seen anything like this. And apparently many Poles had not seen anything like this either, because it was quickly christened the winter of the century, Zima Stulecia. And on January 1st, 1979, a natural disaster was declared. But I still wanted to stay. I was very much in love. And around the end of January, Hanya and I went back to the visa office to apply for an extension of my work visa. And the first time we were denied, Hanya wasn't too worried. She said, "You just try again." We did. We were denied the second time. The third time, they took me upstairs and kept her downstairs. She usually came along to interpret. And I was led into a room where a man sat behind an empty desk. And he looked across the desk and he said, "Do you want to extend your visa?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, if you help us, we'll help you." And my first thought was, my life is not a movie. What is going on? But he was dead serious, and he explained that I had contacts with Poles, which I did, and contacts with foreigners. I guess they knew that I would go to the American Embassy Library and prepare my classes. He said, "You just come once a week and you tell us what people are saying." He said, "It's not that different from the journalism you were doing in the States." I guess he hadn't seen All the President's Men. He said, "If you accept, we'll extend your visa indefinitely. But you can't tell your little friend downstairs." And I was not tempted from the beginning that would have been the clincher. I declined. He was nonplussed. He said, "Well, there's nothing I can do about your visa." It expired 3 days later, so 2 days later, Hanya saw me off on a night train to Budapest, where I took a night train to Bucharest, where I caught a night train to Sofia and then a train to Athens. The point was to save money on hotels. I went to Athens because I had a friend from my school in France who lived in Athens, and I thought he might be able to help me out. I stayed with him for a week. I found a job. There was a guy in Greece who was like a one-man Berlitz with English schools all over Greece. And I walked into his office, and he barely looked up. He said, "English? American?" I said, "American." He said, "We have a job for you in Arta." He pointed on this map of Greece. And Arta's way in. Has anybody been to Arta? Of course not. Nobody goes to Arta, except desperate young Americans. But I went to Arta and taught English in a school that was the complete opposite of the school in Poland. It was purely a money-making operation. The director of the school barely spoke English, and he was very upset that I was there because I could find, I could discover now that he didn't speak English. So he basically ignored me. I found out that all the students passed at the end of the year because he found out if he kept them back, they would drop out and he'd lose money. I rented a room in an old stone house that had no heating. There was sunny Greece, right? I could see my breath in my room for the first 2 months, so I could never do anything there. At night I would go to the cafes and write letters and write my journals. The cafes were only men. No women were allowed in the cafes. And this was a shock to me, not just as an American, but as an American who'd come from Poland, where there was much more equality between the sexes. And, you know, it's funny, we thought, in the US, we thought of Poland as a kind of backward country behind the Iron Curtain, but in Greece it seemed much more modern and progressive to me. And it was in Greece, I think, that really kind of cemented my love of the unsung. You know, Greece is a much romanticized Mediterranean country, but I found Poland to be much more admirable in many ways than Greece. And yeah, I grew up in New Jersey, so I have a natural love for the unsung, but it really grew in Greece. I went to Athens. I stuck out the winter and spring, and I went to Athens to apply for a visa to go back to Poland. And my point was, I wanted to spend the winter somewhere in Europe in hopes that Hania and I could get together in the summer. I went to the Polish embassy in Athens. Didn't think I had much of a chance to get a visa after what had happened in Warsaw, but I did. I got a visa to go back to Warsaw. And what made it even more unusual was that my visit back to Poland was the first 2 weeks of June. It was the same time that Pope John Paul II was going to make his first trip back as Pope. And a few days after I arrived, we went to see him arrive. On the morning of June 2nd, we walked a few blocks to join the crowds lining Babelska Street to greet the Pope's motorcade. Yellow and white papal flags waved in unison with white and red Polish flags. When the Pope-mobile finally appeared, the man inside received the greeting of a returning hero. With the love and admiration, though, came a beseeching hopefulness. The Pope was the ultimate immigrant in a country with a long history of producing them. And it was clear that Poles looked to him as someone who could improve their lot, perhaps, as the Vicar of Christ, perform miracles. That afternoon we went to the Mass on Victory Square, and I didn't understand the homily, but it was clear it was having a profound effect, as was the sight of thousands of Poles gathered together on the main square of the capital, listening to the words of their Pope, which they admired much more than the words of their leaders. Hania and I got out for a vacation in France, and then we split up again. She went back to Poland, I came back to the States, and I moved back in with my parents before it was fashionable, and I just kind of floundered. I half-heartedly looked for a job. I did find a gig co-authoring a coffee table book titled New Jersey Unexpected Pleasures. And it was a beautiful book. It was a collaboration of photographers and writers. And I wrote about Patterson, the Meadowlands, cranberries, glass and porcelain, malls, and bridges. But I just felt that my time in Poland was very unsatisfactory. And I wrote to Hania, I said, why don't I come back? I take my job at the English Language College and we get married. I did go back I arrived in September of 1980. It was easier getting visas now because 1 month earlier, Lech Wałęsa had climbed the gates of the Lenin shipyards in Gdańsk, and Solidarity had been born. And reading about Solidarity in the States, I thought it was relegated to factories and shipyards. But it infiltrated all institutions in Poland. We had a Solidarity chapter at school. And I wanted to join. Hania vetoed it. She said, if Solidarity is crushed, you'll be deported. And it was interesting, our different outlooks. I, with my American optimism, thought this is a wonderful thing and things are just going to get better and better. Hania, with her Polish sense of history, had a much more pessimistic view. We got married in October, a very small wedding. The year-long separation had really taken a toll on our relationship, and it took a while to get back to where we'd been. And we lived like most Polish newlyweds. We lived with family. In our case, it was Hania's aunt and cousin. And I would sit with them at the kitchen table, drinking tea and trying to catch snippets of their conversation. Because I wanted to learn Polish now, really, and as quickly as possible. Because everybody was having discussions, reading the papers. I wanted to know what was being said. And I really threw myself into it. I watched, and I changed my attitude. Instead of complaining about it, I decided to embrace it, which is the only way to learn another language. You know, I tried to savor the fact that you walk down the street to the biblioteki, but then you read quietly in the bibliotece. I watched a lot of television. I was the only one in the household that loved when the Russian movie came on TV, because it would have subtitles and a speaker, the inimitable Polish speaker, who was a man who read every line of every character, no matter the gender, in the same bland, monotone voice. But I loved him, because he would say the words I would see on the screen. And I'd sit there with pen and paper, and I'd write down the words I didn't know. And when the movie was over, I'd go look them up in the dictionary, and I'd make lists of my vocabulary words. One day in a bookstore, I found a book with screenplays from 4 movies by Krzysztof Zanussi, a very popular Polish director at the time. Screenplays, if you're trying to learn to speak a language, screenplays are the best, because it's the everyday speech of everyday people. You know, novels have too much description that you're not going to use. Even plays can be a bit didactic. So I read the screenplays of Zanussi. Reading, I would sail along for a sentence or two and then come up against a vowelless wall. While I had made my peace with the grammar, pronunciation was an ongoing battle. Nouns and verbs appeared like unwieldy contraptions, thick, airtight, impenetrable, out of which proper words might be formed with the merciful gift of an A, E, I, O, or U. I question how any human mouth could render into sound these seemingly random clusters of letters, these alphabet-ending consonant clots. And I wondered about the masochism of a people who had created such an obstacle course of a language. Numbers were the worst. 1939 translated to 1939. It's even more daunting when you see it written. 1939 was a year that you heard mentioned quite a bit in Poland. It was the year the Germans invaded and World War II began. My father, who never wrote, my mother was the correspondent in the family, but my father wrote one letter urging me to come home with Hania. He said, because he couldn't stop thinking of September 1st, 1939. I was not tempted to come home. I thought, I was in the center of everything that was happening. From a writer's point of view, it was a great place to be. Perhaps a lack of imagination explained my willingness to stay, but I felt like I'd been given a do-over with Poland, and I really wanted to make the most of it now. The situation was increasingly tense as 1981 continued. There was a new disconnect. There was the political excitement, but there was then economic frustration because there were more and more shortages. There were lines outside of shops. At school, every month we got ration cards for meat, butter, sugar, and women especially spend hours every day waiting in lines to buy simple goods. For Easter, the family sent me to Vienna for grocery shopping, because I was the only one at home who had a passport. And it's really my only trip to Vienna. So, you know, the city that for most people is one of palaces and museums, for me is a city of beautifully well-stocked grocery stores. In the fall of 1981, we got a telephone at home. We had no telephone. And we finally got one, which was a great joy. We could now call people and tell them we were coming. We didn't just drop in. And I never called my parents while I was living abroad. It just seemed, you know, just why would I call them? It was just too out of the realm of my thinking. But December 12th came, it was my father's birthday, and we had a new telephone. So I picked the phone up to call him and wish him a happy birthday, and the line was dead. And I didn't think much of it until the next morning. We had a knock on the door. Our neighbor, Piotr, told us that martial law had been declared. And we turned on the television, and there was a man in a military uniform giving all the new rules and regulations. Schools were closed until after the holidays. Cinemas, concert halls, theaters were closed indefinitely. They didn't want people congregating. Telephones were disconnected. The borders were closed to Poles. The Solidarity's leaders were being rounded up and interned. There were tanks and soldiers in the streets. And just like that, overnight, all the dreams of Solidarity were crushed. And Hanya's original pessimism turned out to be very prescient. The year 1982 started, schools resumed. I saw my students, and my admiration for them grew even more. They were treating the biggest disappointment in their life with great, I think, great stoicism, humor, in some cases, underground activities. There were a lot of jokes. Why did Hitler lose the war? We failed to disconnect the telephones. There were a lot of jokes, but people were very depressed. It was a very, very depressing time. And there was a curfew, there wasn't much to do. So I threw myself even deeper into my study of Polish. And I decided to finally tackle the epic poem of Poland, Pan Tadeusz by Adam Mickiewicz. The Poles here know who Adam Mickiewicz was. He was the great romantic 19th century poet who grew up in Lithuania, speaking Polish, writing in Polish. He was exiled to Central Russia for advocating for Polish independence. He ended up in Paris, pining and writing about Poland, Lithuania. And Pan Tadeusz is this real homesick love letter to Poland and all things Polish. And it has a story and it has a historical context, but what I liked with the digressive flights is his homesick homages to everything from singing frogs to cold borscht. At one point, he even makes fun of Italy and its trees. I should say, I read it with the original version and an English translation, which I heavily depended on. But with Italy, he said, the vaunted cypress, tall and thin, to boredom rather than to grief akin. Is not our honest birch a fairer one? It's like a peasant weeping for her son, or a widow for her husband as she stands, hair streaming to the ground and wrings her hands. And, to claim a tree's aesthetic superiority because of its resemblance to mourning, its echoes of tragedy, seemed very Polish. It seemed very Polish to me. Spring came, school ended. I had very emotional farewells to the teachers, the students, the staff. Honey and I had decided we would leave there was no reason to stay in Poland now. There was no hope for the foreseeable future. Martial law was still in effect. And I wanted to stay through the summer so I could walk on the pilgrimage to Częstochowa. Częstochowa is the home of the Jasnogóra Monastery, which holds the painting of the Black Madonna. The Black Madonna is revered by many Poles as a protectress of Poland. Lech Wałęsa would sometimes wear a pin on his lapel with the picture of the Black Madonna. I saw her more as a kind of alter ego. She has a very mournful, wounded expression, literally wounded expression. There are two scars on her right cheek, and there are various theories as to how the scars got there. But I think when many Poles look at the painting of the Black Madonna, they see the pain and suffering that Poland has been through. And if anyone's curious about the painting, there's a copy in St. Patrick's Cathedral, which I just saw this morning. So I wanted to walk on this pilgrimage. On August 15th, the Feast of the Assumption, pilgrims from all over Poland gather in Częstochowa. The pilgrimage from Warsaw takes 9 days. It covers about 140 miles. And in preparation for it, I spent the summer walking around Warsaw. And we lived in a district called Ochota, which was pretty far from everything. It was near the airport. And that's where I would start my walks. One morning I set off down Opachewska and kept on walking to the center of town, crossed the Poniatowski Bridge, and strolled the length of Saska Kempo all the way down to the British Club, where I played 2 sets of tennis with a friend. Another morning I walked to Wola before heading up to Moranów. I skimmed the parks, Łazienki, Pole Mokotowski, Ogród Saski, but never entered them. On their quiet tree-lined lanes, I would have felt as if I were in any European city, while here on the sidewalks, as I dodged the queues and imperiously parked cars, eyed the drab mannequins and the stylish young women, there was no doubt as to where I was. I had developed extremely warm feelings for Warsaw. It was not just the city I'd lived in the longest. It was the one I had been through the most with, and these long walks cemented my attachment. It lacked the ethnic neighborhoods I was used to finding at home, but it had its share of characters. They were just all Polish characters, or C. Mickiewicz, Lithuanian, Ukrainian, Jewish, Tatar, hence the beauty that went far beyond blonde. Its lowly status, not just among capitals, but vis-a-vis Krakow, its shortage of glamour, its grim and dowdy history had all, over time, endeared it to me. As had, of course, my learning its language. And my affection was sharpened by being uncommon. For the correspondence, Warsaw was just one city, albeit an intoxicating one, in a career of foreign postings. An expat writer's own Berlin, London, Rome, Paris. Everyone, not just the literati, had Paris, and so the saying went, always would. Warsaw felt like mine alone. Such is the beauty of unsung places. So on August 5th, I went to Plac Zamkowy and found the largest gathering of Poles since martial law. And we walked through the city that day like a liberating army. It seemed like half of the residents had come out to wish us Godspeed, and elderly women were standing with tears rolling down their faces, and workers stood on concrete walls and gave us V signs, and it was a perfect way for me to leave Poland. We came back to the States, settled in Philadelphia. Hanya got into the City and Regional Planning Department at University of Pennsylvania. I got a job working for a medical magazine put out by the American College of Physicians, something I had very little qualifications for. And then a few years later, in that same tradition, I got a job as an editorial writer at the Providence Journal in Rhode Island. Both those misbegotten episodes are written about in the book. And then 1989 came, that momentous year. And the first Saturday in June, Hanya and I boarded a chartered bus in Philadelphia that was coming here to New York to the Polish consulate. carrying a group of Poles who were voting in parliamentary elections. And I'm just going to close with this description of that day. Anya had made her way inside, and we climbed the red-carpeted circular staircase. I'd never been in this part of the consulate when applying for visas, and it was difficult to shed my usual feeling of angst. Though now the situation was deliciously reversed. Rather than the government officials holding our fate in their hands, Hania and her compatriots held the fate of Poland in theirs. After Hania voted, we returned to the main hall to observe the scene. Women in summer dresses, grandmothers who looked as if they'd come straight from their Silesian villages, a large number of men with mustaches. Their light-hued summer clothing seemed at odds with their hard, somber, rough-hewn countenances. Despite the elegant surroundings, no one looked dazzled or out of place. In fact, there was an endearing casualness to the crowds that made me think of the Sempe illustration. Outside, we lingered some more. Everyone around us was speaking Polish. I was an electrician in Poland, a man from Rzeszów told me, but now I'm an auto mechanic. See? And he held out a knobby, grease-stained hand, unaccustomed to the environs of Madison Avenue. There was something about the scene, the soft summer air, the labored faces, the pensive, not quite festive atmosphere that seemed familiar. And then I remembered the Pope's Mass in Warsaw 10 years earlier, almost to the day. There as well, on a much larger scale, had been this same subdued, hopeful gathering, this same coming together of national aspirations. And it seemed fitting that election day at the consulate should echo the Pope's return to Poland, because it was, indisputably, a direct descendant of it. All right, I'll close there and be happy to answer any questions anybody has. Yeah.
How long did it take you to actually write the book? Was it based on your journals that you kept and you finally just put it all together? How long was the process?
The writing took about a year, and I'll tell you, I wrote it without using, I did have journals. I didn't mention that I'd kept the journals since college, but in Poland it became a diary. There was so much happening. So I did have a pretty accurate record of what was happening. But when I wrote the book, I didn't look at my journals because I didn't want that voice of a 28-year-old, 30-year-old. I wanted the voice of someone my age looking back at that experience. So when I finished the writing, then I went back to the journals and read them, and I realized things I'd forgotten. Some scenes I'd completely forgotten that I added to the book, and some conversations. I don't like, a lot of memoirs have a lot of dialogue. And I'm always curious how people can remember dialogues they had when they were children. I guess because I started out in newspapers, I don't invent. I don't like to make things up. So the dialogues in the book are all things I remember or I had written down in my journals. So I'd say a little over a year writing and then adding things from the journals. Yes?
When was the last time you visited?
The last time I was in Poland was last year. Hania and I go back most years now. And we were in Warsaw, Krakow, Zakopane. And,
how did the country change in the course?
For the most part, it changed. Well, it changed a lot, and I think for the most part, the better. Warsaw now is a really, I think, beautiful city. Very, very vibrant city with a lot happening. It always did have a lot of trees. I mean, there are lots of beautiful parks and it was a very green city. And the foreign correspondence in Warsaw was always described Warsaw as gray. That was the all-purpose adjective because, overcast skies, gray apartment blocks, winter was kind of gray. But in the summer, it's very green. But yeah, I mean, Warsaw, I think, it's become a real world-class capital. Mentality has changed a little bit. You can't just stop by somebody's apartment and have tea for 3-4 hours like you used to, you know? Work is obviously much more important now. So social life has, I think, taken a hit. But, you know, most of our friends are doing very well, their children are doing well. It's prosperous, and that's very nice
That
to see.
psychologically, sort of it also changed to the best, I hope. That,
Mostly for the best, I think. Yeah. Yes?
How prominent is Catholicism now as opposed to 20 years ago?
Well, I don't know, 20 years ago. I was there 40 years ago, and obviously it was very important. It was working hand in hand with solidarity. It's, you know, I'm not really that current with what's going on in Poland now. To some extent I am. But I did see Timothy Garton-Ash. He's a writer, a British writer who's written about Poland for many, many years, since Solidarity. He had a poll recently of Poles who trust the Catholic Church now, compared to, I think it was 20 years ago. And 20 years it was about 50% of Poles. Now it's about 31%. So it's really dropped. So that has changed a lot. Alan?
Have you heard from any of your former students or fellow teachers?
Yeah, unfortunately I've fallen out of touch with most of my students. There's one student who I do keep in touch with, and he became a journalist. And he's doing quite well, and I see him every time I go to Warsaw. Yeah. And the teachers, unfortunately, many of them have died. And the schools have changed completely too. Yes?
Wonderful book, and I have to say that it's such a powerful language. I wonder if it's maybe because it deals with the everyday life and so on. And especially to hear from someone that immigrated from this side of the Atlantic to Poland at that particular time period, which was difficult in Polish history. So I think that's sort of, for some of us maybe in the audience that can connect with that experience. It's really very, as you write, recreates very well exactly what was going on in that time period. So it's very well written. So thank you very much for sharing. And my question is there anything that you wanted to do at that time, which was obviously very difficult, that you did not do, and if you would have a chance to go back, you would do that now,
Was there anything I wanted to do then that I couldn't?
Besides joining the Solidarity.
Yeah, it's too late for that. No, nothing that I really wanted to do. I think there's some places I wanted to visit that I still haven't. The city of Turin. I've never been there, and I've always wanted to go, and we were supposed to go there 2 years ago when we were in Poland, and I got sick, and we didn't make it. So that's on my list, to go to Turin. Yeah, I can't think of anything that I wanted to do that I didn't do.
And I have a very short follow-up question. Is Hani with us this evening?
Is
Is your lovely wife with us this evening?
No, she's not, unfortunately. She's back in Florida, and she's recovering, unfortunately. She's okay, but didn't feel well enough to travel, so unfortunately. And she's heard me many times, so she's tired of this talk. Yes, Liz.
Well, I now have a daughter who lives in Berlin, and so we travel back and forth there a bit. And one of the things we've noticed is the nostalgia that you see in certain quarters for the DDR. My daughter, as a joke, gave me something on dating a cookbook, which is full of all kinds of dreadful recipes. And is there any kind of similar nostalgia, like for pre-1989 Poland? Or have they escaped that?
Not much, no. I remember I read an interesting anecdote. Somebody went to Budapest and he was talking to the taxi driver. The taxi driver was saying how much better everything was back then. You know, oh, this is better than this. And the guy said, no, but the guy argued, no, it wasn't better. You know, we had this, and the taxi driver finally said, yeah, but I was younger. Then things are good. Yeah. All right. Well, if there are no other questions,
One
yeah.
quick one. You had a wonderful writer to the introduction to your book, Pico, on here. How do you know Pico? How did you get him to do that? It's quite a coup, I think, to have someone
Yeah.
that caliber to.
Pico Iyer, who wrote the introduction, very graciously. He's a friend of mine. I met him years ago when he came to Miami. He read from his book about Cuba, Cuba in the Night or something. And we went for coffee afterwards. And he's the only person I still exchange letters with, actual letters. We write but so yeah, I've known him for many years, and he was very gracious to do that. Yeah. Yes.
You said that during the martial law, in private homes, the discussions were very spirited, lively. When you interact with people nowadays, when you go to their apartments, do you find that of course, that the dynamic is different, it's no martial law, but
In
there
Poland?
Yes, is there anything that you sort of are bewildered by or surprised when it comes to the dynamic between people?
Well, I think there's still lively discussions because in some families, like my wife's, you have people who are, peace, people, and there are people who are the opposition. So you get some very heated discussions, yeah. And I think it's, I don't know, I'm making a generalization here, but I think it's in the character of Poles, no? They're politically intense people. The story is you put two Poles in a room and you get three political parties. There's a real energy that Poles feel politically, and yeah, I think that still exists, definitely. All right, well, I'm going to sign, I think there's going to be wine downstairs, and I'm happy to talk some more, and I'm also happy to sign, I have a few books. So if anybody wants to buy it, I'll happy to sign it. So thank you again. Thank you for coming.